Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Welcome to another weekly study training for your ACE exam. And I wanted to talk to you about something in chapter 9. A student had brought it up, really good point, related to some of the terminology and the muscles and what they do. And the main terms that came up were prime movers and synergists. Okay, and what is a synergist? What is a prime mover? At a particular joint, when is the muscle or which muscle is the prime mover for this particular kinesiological function, and then which muscles are going to be the synergist. And remember, prime mover is technically, we would call this the agonist, or that muscle which is predominantly responsible for the particular movement of a joint action. So knee flexion, knee extension. Keep in mind that anytime you start navigating through some of this material in chapter 9, particularly table 9.4, 9.5, and those other ones that are speaking to joint action, you've got to go back and memorize. Make sure you already know. I forgot what page it's on. Page 334 in the 6th edition, by the way. Fundamental movements from anatomical position, right? So you've got to know kinesiological terminology: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion at the ankle, things like that. Once you get those, now you can start to navigate and understand a little bit more about muscle action. And so the point here is that it can be a little confusing, and the reason it's confusing is because, in particular, this one student was looking at some other materials, actually other ACE material, and there may be a little discrepancy from one context to the other. So here's tip number 1: is always stay with the textbook. I'm just going to be honest with you. When it comes to the testing, which is really where you're focused, is when in doubt, you stay with the textbook. And you'll hear, or you'll read, students will tell you over and over that have already taken the exam, irrespective of the particular exam that is being given. It's generally going to come from the textbook. So tip number 1: when in doubt, you always stay with the textbook. Now, of course, ACE does have a study companion, right? Little workbook that's also very helpful. Some folks have said it's very helpful, and others don't use it. Depends on what you've purchased from ACE, of course. They have a ton. By the way, ACE has a ton of resources and information. Utilize them. They're really, really very good when it comes to passing the exam. But specifically into chapter 9, the post that the student made was in reference to prime movers versus synergist. And the reason we even use that terminology, and I'm taking you out of this context and putting you into the real world for a second. The only reason in kinesiology biomechanics we even discuss these terms versus like agonist and antagonist, we talk about prime movers because if we're doing electro studies and trying to figure out which muscles are more dominant than other muscles during particular movements, it's just kind of helpful to distinguish between that larger muscle that is generally responsible for a particular joint movement, like knee flexion, right? So the hamstring group. What we can do is we can actually look at, and this is going to help, say, a physical therapist or a doctor to determine which muscles are creating problems or which muscles are dysfunctional from a neuromuscular perspective. We can now say that in general, this particular muscle, the semimembranosus, for instance, was injured, it was pulled, torn, whatever the case is, generally is supposed to be a prime mover, but for some reason, because of injury or whatever, the other two, biceps femoris and semimembranosus, just as a for instance, maybe those guys are pulling the majority of the force load, and now the other muscle, just for instance, now is no longer providing prime mover status. It might just be, because of its injury, just as a for instance, providing synergistic assistance. But there's also the reality that at other joints in your body, we know clearly that there are major prime mover muscles, for instance, the gluteus maximus, just as a for instance, the gluteus maximus is in general, depending on where the hip is positioned, is the prime mover because through testing and research, you can literally place electrodes and pick up the amount of activity that is occurring when a movement occurs in a particular muscle. So we know that the gluteus maximus, just as a for instance, is generally going to be the prime mover at the hip for hip extension. Now, it doesn't mean that the hamstring group is not a prime hip extensor. And this is where the problem comes in. The hip extensors are the gluteus maximus, just as a for instance, and the hamstring group. Well, depending on whether you have flexed the hip or you're in full extension at the hip, those guys work in conjunction with each other. But who is the prime mover when you're in the bottom of a squat to initiate the movement? Well, it's the gluteus maximus. At that point, the gluteus maximus at the bottom of a squat initiates hip extension. The hamstrings, for the most part, are assistive. They are not the prime hip extensor. They are providing synergistic application of force load to help the glutes. And then guess what happens? As the hip extends and you start to get up a little bit straighter, believe it or not, the hamstrings start to take on a more prominent role. And then ultimately, as you almost get to the top position, the gluteus maximus, for the most part, ceases to be active to any great extent. And you know this anyway, because once you get up to the top position of a squat, you have to flex your glutes to make them even work, right? They don't really provide much force load production. The hamstrings actually provide a fair amount, and there's other things that occur. And I don't want to get off topic, but I want you to understand that when you understand that prime mover synergists is not only related to the size and potential power output and force load production capabilities of a particular muscle, it's also related to the position of the joint. And this is one of the things in kinesiology and in biomechanics in particular that allows us to understand a little bit better about the neuromuscular apparatus and therefore why it's important from a training perspective. So with that sort of as an intro, I hope that didn't divert us too much. I want to go back to what this one student had spoken about, which is how do I know, and is there a list of prime movers and synergists? Well, I guess you can Google, right, and kind of, Google prime movers synergists for a particular joint. You could do that. I'm not sure what you're going to pop up with, but really you don't have to in one sense. You actually have it right in front of you. Because remember, a prime mover is generally going to be within the grouping of muscles that all perform the same action, okay? At the hip joint, what did I just say? Gluteus maximus, and there's 3 muscles in the hamstring group. They all do functionally the same thing at the hip joint, don't they? Well, somebody's got to be in charge. Somebody's got to be the quote prime mover. Or do they? It changes during an actual movement. So the idea of prime mover synergist, it's actually a moving target. So what we do, just to help you to understand how you can define whether a muscle is a synergist for this particular kinesiological movement, or it's the prime mover, one of the first things we look at is what's the size of the muscle? Is it a superficial or is it an intrinsic muscle? If it's an intrinsic smaller muscle located deep inside in the joint areas, it's probably not going to be the prime mover for that kinesiological action, okay? Again, classic example would be, let's say hip flexion or hip extension. The prime movers for hip flexion and hip extension are the larger superficial muscles that we are all pretty much aware of, right? In hip extension, it's the gluteus maximus. In hip flexion, it could be the rectus femoris or the iliacus or psoas or the iliopsoas complex. which is going to be more the case. With hip adduction, just as a for instance, it's going to be right the adductor brevis, just as a for instance, or the other aforementioned adductor muscles, right? Abduction, what's the primary mover for abduction at the hip? Probably the tensor fasciae lata would fall into that, perhaps, but it depends on whether the hip is externally rotated or internally rotated. It also depends on if the hip is in a flex position, in a seated position. So I'm seated right now. My hips are flexed at 90 degrees. If I was to apply resistance to move my knees outward or to abduct at this point, well, it's no longer the TFL or the tensor fasciae lata that is considered the prime mover. Technically, the prime mover would be the gluteus medius. Okay. If, again, I don't want to go too far into that. I'm trying to help you to understand that it's a moving target when we talk about prime movers and synergists. But number one, the bigger the muscle, especially if that's its sort of only function, that's probably going to be your prime mover. Number two, depending on the position of the joint. This is, of course, very apparent in a joint complex like the pelvis and the hips. Not so much at the knee, not so much at the elbow, kind of at the wrist, but I don't really get into that. So as an introduction to this topic of prime movers and synergists, I hope that makes sense. And by the way, even though they are some terms that are used, you're probably not going to see any more than a few questions on the distinction between which is the prime mover and which is the synergist. I know on previous versions, like the 5th edition, 4th edition of the NASM textbook, that might have been more of the case, but 6th edition, they tend to focus a lot more on actual situational type of questions related to this information. However, with that said, now when you're on page 341 or 340, muscle function, this is where the meat and potatoes of this topic comes in, because you're not going to see the term synergist. Why? Because again, the term synergist, when it comes to muscle action, is kind of a moving target. The assumption is that if it's a smaller muscle and it also does what a much larger, more powerful force-producing muscle can do, same kinesiological function, it is probably an assisting or synergistic muscle in general. Okay, so if you look at table 9.4, this is what I would do, always the recommendation. Okay, go ahead and grab a pad and write it out. Okay, now let me give you another tip. Tip number 2, tip number 3, whatever it is. Table 9.4. I'm pretty sure that we've gone over this in the general study guide. Tables 9.4, 9.5, 9.6, 9.7, 9.8, 9.9, 9.10, and 9.11, because those are all the major joints that we're talking about, major muscles that act on them. In all cases, if you've got 6 months to study and you're doing great through everything, you can actually work through the entire table. But I don't recommend that, because for the most part on these tables, the selected exercise is not something that you're probably going to need to spend a whole lot of time memorizing. So again, keep in mind, the goal is to pass the exam, right? That is the primary goal. Now, you also want to be able to know material after you pass the exam to use in your toolbox. But when all is said and done, the recommendation from a purely studying memorization perspective, look at your tables and then decide on what is critically important to memorize from a table. I'm going to tell you right now, for the most part, from a testing perspective, ACE doesn't ask a whole lot of questions on origins and insertions. They don't. Now, from a purely academic perspective, it's not a bad idea to know this, but are you going to be teaching and studying anatomy phys to that level as a personal trainer? The answer is no. So what I do is, when it comes to really studying this material, is I look at table 9.4 and I rewrite it. I draw out my table Draw it out. And by the way, yeah, use your, and I think the student actually did a really great job on this, the one that I'm referring to, using colored markers and drawing things. Remember, read, write, and again, that's that other venue, recite. So say it out loud. That does help. But if you're not going to recite it, you got to read it and rewrite. But when I say rewrite, what I'm saying is, yes, use a pen, use a pencil, because you're going to need to rewrite it over and over and over, right? And that's what's going to embed it into your shortened and midterm memory. But drawing is part of the rewriting process as well. So definitely draw pictures, and you'll hear, or excuse me, you'll read comments from students all the time. This is what I did. I drew pictures, and I've seen 1,000 posts, for instance, on the Facebook group where students are showing their entire wall of pictures of just drawings, and man, you'd be amazed at how much that can help depending on your learning style. So I write the muscle, and again, column 1, muscle, and I'm going to write the name of the muscle. I'm going to bypass origin and insertion. Don't write those things down. And then I'm going to look at primary function, dorsiflexion. So anterior tibialis, all right, tibialis anterior. Okay, do yourself a favor. Go down and point to your tibialis anterior, or go onto Google and look at it. Touch, that's your tibialis anterior. When you pull your toe towards your knee, you're going to feel that front part of your shin. When I was in the Army, we used to do 10 and 15-mile road marches. I used to get what we commonly term shin splints. You ever have a shin splint? Man, I used to get those all the time and never understood it until I started to understand more about anatomy. What was happening was I was getting inflammation in the tibialis anterior, right underneath, in that fascial component underneath that muscle, tibialis anterior. That's the large muscle that it pulls the toe up, and then you can step forward, and that's called dorsiflexion, right? That's why you got to know your kinesiological term. So I would write that down. Anterior tibialis, dorsiflexion. Okay, now here's where this is where, again, it's a lot of information. Now you've got this other term called inversion. Okay, do yourself a favor, just memorize it, so that if I was to ask you, what does a tibialis anterior do? What's its main or primary function at the ankle? It's to dorsiflex and inversion. Okay, you just got to memorize it. Okay, and then I would write all these down. But here's what our one student realized, that because there's no term here that says synergist, what you want to do now, again, I'm going to go down primary function. I'm going to try and memorize the muscle and what its kinesiological function is. I'm not going to do selected exercises. I'm not interested in that from a memorization perspective. I don't need to know that. From a prime mover synergist perspective, I need to know the name of the muscles and what their kinesiological functions are. But here's what you do. Group them. You're the one writing it, so you don't have to write down everything exactly the way they have it. Group your muscles together that all function in that kinesiological function that they do. So the anterior tibialis dorsiflexion, just look on page 341 if you're with me, table 9.4, look down, and what other muscles are dorsiflexes? Whoa, here we go. Dorsiflexion and ankle, anterior tibialis, and I move down and I get to my extensor hallucis longus. Okay. Now, if you want to make it a hard C, you can do that, Lucas, but it's hallucis longus. Dorsiflexion and invert. Wait a minute, they're both the same. You get the idea. That's all you're going to do, is you're going to look at the particular muscle and see its primary function. All I'm telling you to do from a studying perspective is start over here on the primary function and see all of those muscles that are involved with dorsiflexion at the ankle. And I'm going to write down dorsiflexion. And by the way, if you want to highlight it, right, dorsiflexion. So I got 1, 2, and I'm giving you this study methodology if, like, the student that I'm referring to wants to discern whether it's a prime mover or a synergist. That's what we're doing. But by the way, it's also helpful just so you know kinesiologically the function of particular muscles and how they're grouped. So I've got one, two. Ooh, I've got the extensor digitorum longus is also a dorsiflexor. So that's 3 dorsiflexors at the ankle. 4, the peroneus tertius plantaris. Say that 3 times fast. That's a dorsiflexor. And so you see how I'm doing this. So I've got 1, 2, 3. I've got 4 dorsiflexors of the ankle. Is it really that important to know that these 3 guys down here are basically synergists? Okay, it's not a bad idea. The reality is that the tibialis anterior, that's your quarterback. That's the one, that's the prime mover for dorsiflexion. But again, it's a moving target in one sense. Depending on whether the foot is inverted or everted, whether it is abducted or adducted, can determine the total force load or force production of those particular muscles. But the assumption is straight on dorsiflexion. Prime mover is the tibialis anterior, and those other guys are synergist, even though it doesn't say it. Okay, so I hope that helps, because it's a good question, and it's a point that needs to be made if the use of the term synergist is in some of the material and it's being asked on the test, for instance. Then it's a good idea to know this. So that is table 9.4. I'll give you an example where perhaps you're not. Now, if you go to table 9.5, the knee. Look at your major muscles that act at the knee. Again, you can look at, all I do is make a chart, and I've got 2 columns, muscle kinesiological function. And that's one of the easier ways to memorize it. But take a look first at the primary functions. I've got an extension. Okay, so I've got 2 extensions, and what are they? The rectus femoris and the vastus group, or the 3 vastus muscles, lateralis, medialis, intermedius, right? You'll notice that, just as a for instance, the vastus group, that's all they do is extension. The rectus femoris, however, has 2 main functions. One is extension with the vastus group, and the other is hip flexion. Now, and by the way, you're going to see that when you go back here. Well, that's the ankle and the foot. But when you get to the hip, you're going to see the rectus femoris. The point is that on this particular column, you can continue the muscles all the way down if you wanted to get a full list of every muscle and what their primary functions are, whether they're prime or synergist or not. The point here is that now I can look at the knee, and I know that more than likely one of these is the prime and the other is the synergist. Or is that true? And the answer is technically no. There is no synergist with knee extension. There's really only the prime movers, because all 4 of those muscles, they all work at the same time in conjunction. Depends maybe if the hip is in a flexed position, then the rectus femoris is going to be more or less effective. Does that make it the prime mover or the synergist? Technically, the vastus group, they're always the prime mover. The problem, of course, is, like I'm saying, it's a moving target. Are they the synergist when the hip is flexed, or are they the synergist when the hip is extended? That's up to you to make that decision, but you're probably not going to see a question that asks you to discern whether the vastus medialis is a synergist while the rectus femoris is a prime mover. It's going to be the same thing then with knee flexion. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, those are your 3 hamstring muscles. Now here we see a pretty clear distinction between the size of these particular muscles. And one of the reasons why we can pretty much say that the gracilis and the sartorius and the popliteus, for instance, are synergist is basically because of their size and because of the relation to relative internal or external rotation of the femur to assist with uh, knee flexion. The reality is that the hamstring group, those three muscles are large. They have a very high power output, force load power output associated with them. They're your prime movers. Generally, you're going to see those other three, again, the gracilis, sartorius, popliteus, are going to be synergists. So you could, with a high level of confidence, say that is the case. Not really sure I've ever seen a scenario where the hamstrings are not the prime mover, and no, probably not going to happen. Even when the hip is fully extended and the hamstrings have shortened somewhat, they're still going to be the primary knee flexors. Go on to the hip. Yeah, I know. Table 6. Write it down anyway. There's 1, 2, 3. I mean, there's a lot of muscles in there. Just keep in mind there is going to be crossover because certain muscles, like the hamstrings, work at the knee and also work at the hip. Okay, that should make it a little bit easier for you to navigate through this. Again, the point is I'm trying to help you to study, effectively for discerning prime mover, synergist. Primary function, flexion, external rotation, I would go ahead and at the hip, who are all of your flexors? Iliopsoas, which is the iliacus psoas major complex and minor. Flexion, rectus femoris flexion. See, all I'm doing is 1, 2, 3, tensor fascia lata. Of course, your TFL is a flexor. Sartorius is a flexor. The pectineus is a flexor. And there you go. So what would you do from a study? Just write it down. If those are all your flexors, take a look at those muscles for a second, folks. Hip flexion, primary muscle, by the way, just on power output alone, just on force production alone, the iliopsoas is a prime mover. You just take a look. There's other areas in the textbook where you can look. It's a very powerful muscle, okay, from one perspective, right? Even though it's not as big as, for instance, the rectus femoris is, the iliopsoas complex, the iliacus and the psoas major minor group have a very high force output, okay, very powerful hip flexors. And so technically they would be prime movers for hip flexion. With the other guys, just as a for instance, the TFL is it's always going to be a synergist. Why? Because the TFL, because of its positioning, actually functions better when just when the femur is either externally, internally rotated. And that's what you're going to see. So hope that helps to understand prime mover, right? Force output, size, force output of the muscle during that kinesiological movement pattern. And then the synergists, the smaller muscles that are also involved with higher levels or lower levels of force output, depending on the positioning of the joint. Muscles that act at the spine do the same thing. Okay, I don't want to be a broken record. Primary function, look at the muscle. Is it a high force, high output, force output muscle? Is it larger than the others? Are there smaller muscles? Spine's a little challenging because they all kind of help each other in these kinesiological movements for the most part. Shoulder girdle and shoulder joint itself. Okay, same thing. Look at your primary functions and what's your primary mover. Obviously the deltoid itself is the prime mover during shoulder abduction. But what else do we have in there? The supraspinatus muscle is it's an ancillary or synergistic muscle that assists and helps with that particular movement. Moving into the elbow, radial ulnar joints. Okay, you got 3 flexors. Once again, it's a little bit easier to understand table 910 from the prime mover synergist perspective because depending on who you read, it's either the biceps brachii, which is the large muscle that we see, we call the biceps, and the brachialis, which is the muscle that lies underneath. Interestingly enough, the brachialis muscle actually has a higher force output generally, depending on the position of the elbow, okay, can generate very high levels of force, which would make it the primary elbow flexor. However, it's generally going to have much higher force output when the hand is in a, or the wrist is in a neutrally pronated position. Okay, and this is because the biceps brachii inserts into the radius. So when you supinate, okay, what is going to be the highest force output flexor? Well, it's probably going to be the biceps brachii, perhaps. Just depends on who you read again. The researchers that do the electromyographs on muscles and test to see which muscles are really creating the highest level of force. Biceps brachii, brachialis. And just keep in mind, normally the brachioradialis, which is the muscle on the outside here of the forearm, it's also an elbow flexor, very dominant, or much more dominant in a pronated position, wrist pronation. So it becomes very, very active, but it's still not, generally, it's still not considered the prime mover. It is always going to be a synergist to elbow flexion in any three basic positions. I've read a ton of research on brachialis being and the biceps brachii. But again, we would normally assume biceps brachii prime mover. The other two guys are synergists in a supinated position, in a neutrally pronated, like a hammer curl. Biceps brachii takes over as the prime mover, biceps brachii and the brachioradialis synergist. And then if I go into here, technically the brachialis is still prime mover. Brachioradialis, biceps brachii are going to be your synergist. Once again, you're not going to see that term on these charts. And then, of course, at the wrist. Boy, I hope that was helpful. I'm going to, once again, normally what we assume is that just studying and memorizing the material is enough, but for sure it is helpful to kind of know primary and synergist from a testing perspective. But I will say again that you're not going to see a whole lot of questions like that generally on the exam. Not saying you're not going to see questions related to them. I'm just saying if you do, it's probably not going to be a whole lot of them. As always, now remember chapter 9. Okay, there's a lot of material in here, but I hope that's helpful. And as always, want to make sure that you pass on your first attempt. Now, if it's not your first attempt, then for sure we want to help you to pass on your whatever attempt it is that you're on. I hope this was helpful, because when you go through chapter 9 in these particular tables, the tendency is going to be to want to memorize this entire table. And I'm just giving you this tip. Not every table that you see in this textbook needs to be memorized. In fact, some of it is just extraneous information that's probably not going to help from a testing perspective. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel, please. And then, of course, you can hit the bell so you can receive notifications. As always, let us know how we can be of assistance here at Body Design University. Specific questions related to materials, we can always do weekly studies on as well. I'm always happy to help you out. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next week. Thanks.